Hey, good to see you guys all here on a Sunday. Thanks for your patience. Sorry today was a little delayed and had to do some adulting today. It's been pretty busy last week or two, and then this coming week is going to be really crazy busy. So I had to get a bunch of errands taken care of today. But it's good to see you guys all here. Mr. Heath was wondering who's all in the chat room. I don't have my normal actual Twitch up. I can't really see who's all here, but Mr. Heath and Painting Troll have been commenting. So if you're also out there, just give us a shout out, say hi, so we know you're here. So Painting Troll was asking just before the stream started. He says every time he looks at the orc and the troll skin on my load screen that the skin amazes him, and he would love to know what colors I used. And it just so happens that you're in luck, because last year my New Year's resolution was to start a painting journal and to write down all the colors I used. And I made it through about the first half of the year before I just stopped doing it because I got lazy. However, those two models were during the period of time when I was writing down the colors I actually used. So I'm going to show you exactly what I did. But first question is, which orc are you talking about? Are you talking about the Atlantis miniature? I'm sorry. The Games Workshop one, where there's the orc and the goblin together on the same base, or are you talking about the two orcs that are facing off in the little diorama? So let me know that, and I'll show you, or I'll talk to you about which other color. That troll was a base coat of Bearing Blue, which is a scale color. So that was the base coat for the skin. So I just based the entire model in that. I added Mojave White to that, which is another scale color. So it's like kind of a little bit darker off-white. And then for the shade, I added to the base coat, the Bearing Blue, I added Mars Orange. So I added some of that because orange is kind of a complementary color to blue. So when you add in the orange, it starts to desaturate the blue, which makes it good for doing shading and darkening things up. And then I know that at the end, I actually took some straight Mars Orange and glazed it into some of the shadows to really start to create some of that contrast in the shadows. The dark part of his skin, because the whole, that's like the main part of the skin. Then he's got this dark, tough hide. And so that was based in Ryla Gray with a small bit of Rainy Gray added to it. The Ryla Gray is the color I use for doing tattoo work. It's kind of a dark blue. Added a little bit of Rainy Gray, which is a lighter gray color to it. And then I actually, for those, I believe I got darker as I went. So I made the tough hides actually kind of get darker as they built up. So I just added black to that mixture to make things darker. The other thing I did was for the stomach and the chest, where there would be kind of his weak spot, the underbelly, soft underbelly. I went with really, really white, so I just kept adding Mojave White to get really light for those areas. But that really created a skin color I didn't really want. I didn't really want it super white, but that was building up those textures like you've seen me do. And then there's like a ton of colors in here because I was just adding until it got to the color I wanted, and I kept just mixing different things together. So you can see the wash then that I did over all the light skin areas is a mixture of Bearing Blue, Caspian Blue, P3 blue ink, and turquoise ink, plus some water and mixing medium. So I use that to glaze over those really, really light areas to get them toned back to a blue color, so they weren't super white. So the top left duo. So those two are, if you go to my website, gorillawithbrush.com, and you go to the blog section, there's a tutorial up on how I painted those two orcs, and it actually does a step-by-step. You'll see each step in the process. It tells you what colors I used. Pretty sure it says what colors I used, but it shows you the step-by-step of building up all the under textures and then glazing over. The main green color for that was Ardennes green. This is my favorite green from Scale Color. So I based with this, and then I was adding khaki colors and mustard colors into it to lighten it, building up all those textures. And then I glazed over everything in multiple passes of a really, really thinned down Ardennes green to just mute everything but tie all the layers together. And then I believe I added some purple to it. Again, doing the complementary colors idea. Added some purple to it to start to shade, and then I did some just straight purple, the sunset purple color, into the shadows. But that should all be, that's all on my website, the GorillaWithABrush.com, under the blog section. Tutorial for painting those orcs. Yep. Yeah, you know what's fun when you start to mess around with putting extra just colors into your shadows, or just doing some different color glazing. You can even use different colors on different sides of the model to sort of indicate where a light source is coming from versus the shadow. And it's one of the tricks that a lot of painters use, people who do canvas painting, the great masters in history. You'll notice that they will, if they have a warm light source, they'll have a cool shadow. So that, the kind of complementary colors, or vice versa, kind of a cooler light source, they put some warmth into the shadows, and so they contrast it that way. But putting colors down into your shadows is really a way to create cool contrast and just create some visual interest in your model. So let's take stock of where we're at. It's been a while. In fact, the last time I painted on camera is almost the last time I painted. I think that I might have finished up the Malifaux commission a little bit off camera, maybe that evening or the next day. But was it 2 weeks ago? I was working on Alley. Then I went and finished up that Malifaux commission and sent it off. That doesn't even feel right as a timeline. I have no idea anymore. It's been a crazy few weeks. But we were sorry, I just ate. So we were working on Alley. We got her the leather belt done. We got the guns done. Her jean shorts are done. I might go back in and touch up a little bit the transition from the green to the blue. Put a little dark line in there to help differentiate the colors. She's getting pretty close to being done. I need to do her buttons on her shirt. I need to do her gloves and wrist straps. Those are just base coated right now, and I need to do her boots, and then obviously the base as well. So that's where we're at with her. However, what I wanted to show you also was this last week, I finally got the package from Atlantis Miniatures in for the dwarfs that they're having me paint. And these things are so cool. I wanted to show off a few to you. So starting off, so here's the Troll Hunter, or the Troll Slayer, I can't remember. I think they call her Troll Hunter. She's got a cool bear skin. She's got those wicked braids. Couple severed troll heads that she's showing off as trophies. This awesome two-handed axe. The detail on these things is just fantastic for their size. I mean, she's like the size of half of my thumb. Show you a couple more. The camera's not even picking up all of some of the subtle texture and details and things that are in here. What's cool about them is they're really not all that expensive of models. I think like the average cost for one of these dwarfs is maybe like they're from Britain, £6. So I don't know, $7 or $8 probably. Now the shipping might be a little painful, but the miniatures themselves are really reasonably priced. Certainly nothing like Games Workshop prices where they would charge you $22 for a model like this. It's a single model. This guy's awesome. He reminds me of Gimli. Wrong weapon, but if you just swapped that out for Gimli's axe, this just looks like Gimli to me. I love it. These guys are awesome. So Painting Troll, I'll answer your question in a second, Heath. Painting Troll is saying he was talking to a portrait artist in his local area the other day, and he was saying because skin tones have a degree of red in them, that painting green as a base color can give good effects because you get the opposing color theory. And I've actually seen that. There are some miniature painters, Shoshi Bauer comes to mind, who will do some of that. Like she'll base coat everything in green and then start building her colors up. And I've seen it work, but I've also seen, I've also seen it look a little odd. One of the issues becomes, to me, when you're painting on such a small palette like this. I mean, like for example, this guy, how much skin area is really showing on him? So you don't have a lot of room to play with creating a lot of that buildup with taking advantage of what the green would give you. It might be a better technique on busts and things where the faces are much larger. So I have seen that technique used on miniature painting, and yeah, give it a try. I tend to like to put my color in later. So I'll just build up my normal flesh tones like you saw me work with Allie. And then if I want sort of a reddish tone to the skin, I'll make sure I glaze in a reddish flesh color at the end. Usually do some purplish cool tones into the deeper shadows to get some of that contrast. But yeah, human skin is surprisingly complex and difficult to paint realistically. And some of those tricks, I'm sure the portrait masters are much better than I am at doing that, so I wouldn't be surprised. Size-wise, I mean, if you compare, Allie's a 75mm scale model, so she's definitely relatively big. You couldn't exactly make this Snow White in the Seven Dwarfs size. The scale doesn't quite work for that. I don't know what else to show you their scale next to. I mean, there he is next to a paint bottle. I could grab I think I have a Space Marine over here. What? Oh, that's a good idea. I'm not sure where that Space Marine model went, actually. But you can see this guy, he's about the same height as a quarter. So, I mean, they're the 28mm scale models, and what that means usually for most sculptors is 28mm from the bottom of the foot up to eye level for a human. So that means that dwarves would obviously be scaled off of a human who is 28mm from their feet to their eyeball level. I know the orcs that they make, I mean, the sculptor of this must have an image of the orcs being, larger than humans, because they're definitely a little taller than 28mm from that height, but yeah, these are definitely good looking beefy dwarves. I think the proportions on them are just perfect. I think the Games Workshop dwarves to me always looked a little comical, a little cartoony. Maybe they fixed it on their newer line. I haven't been following Age of Sigmar as much, but they would have really, really stumpy legs and really over-exaggerated upper bodies. I didn't think they were proportioned very well. But these guys look, straight out of Lord of the Rings or something where I think they look good. So I was thinking about maybe starting on one of these dwarf models today. Or would you guys like to see me continue on Alley? I'm happy to do either one. I'll let you guys decide. The two of you who are in chat right now, you can duke it out. And what would you like me to see me working on? While things catch up. So Painting Troll said the male dwarves look a little bit like they're from World of Warcraft. I'm not a World of Warcraft player, so I'm not totally sure, but I know people have commented that his orcs look like they're very much like the World of Warcraft style, so he might be, whatever style of fantasy art World of Warcraft is, that might be one of his big influences for his lines. All right. Heath says, Alley, I think Painting Troll is referring to saying 50-50, as if maybe saying, it doesn't really matter to me. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So let's keep working on Alley. We'll get her closer to being finished up. I had planned to do some reference lookups for boots and how they wear to work on maybe getting a good realistic look to her boots. But like all my best projects, we're just going to wing it and make it up as we go along. It's more fun that way. You know what's funny? So it's been about 2 weeks since I've painted, as I said. I took some. I was traveling. Oh yeah, Heath had asked me about how my conference went. So it went really well. I think my talk was well received, and while we were there, we met with some different universities about using some curriculum materials we've been designing. So it was a fun trip. It was really nice. It was good to see a couple friends who work at different universities across the country. They were at the conference, so it was good to catch up with some of them. But right before I left on my trip, I had finished a big project. Finished that Malifaux commission. I was waiting for this Atlantis Miniatures commission to come in. So I was kind of in a hobby lull. I didn't really want to start on anything knowing that it would just get interrupted. So I was assembling a Redemptor Dreadnought that's getting painted for Pact Team once the Atlantis Miniatures Trolls are done. So I was working on that a little bit. And then Alyssa and I my wife, we were playing a lot of games together and just spending some time and relaxing in between big hobby projects. And we were played a lot of this new game we bought. It's the Harry Potter deck building game. So I don't know if you guys have heard of this or played it, but it's quite fun. It's a cooperative deck building game. So you take on the roles of Hermione or Harry or Ron. You get to pick your person, and that person has a different starting deck and different special rules. And you work your way up through the 7 years of them being at Hogwarts. And every year gets a little more challenging and adds new cards, adds new game mechanics. It was really, really enjoyable, but we were just playing a ton of that. But anyway, my point on when I started all of that was I find it interesting when I don't paint for a few weeks, like I sit down to start painting again and I have this feeling like I've forgotten everything I know. Just get out of the groove a little bit, and I haven't really forgotten everything, but it just feels like that. I imagine people who play instruments probably feel like that if they haven't practiced for a couple weeks. They probably feel like they can't remember how to play. So my friend Gray, who, if you remember, was supposed to co-host with me a few weeks ago, and then went to a concert and just got cold clocked by a stranger in the parking lot. He messaged me the other day and said that his face is all healed up and he'd love to be on the stream again in a couple weeks when he gets back into town. So that'll be fun. We'll have Gray on later this month maybe. Also, if you saw my tweet a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, there's a very, very, very good chance that I will have a different special guest on the end of this coming week. So I don't know exactly what time I'm going to be streaming this next week, or how many times I'm going to stream. But if and when I do, somebody is going to come stay with me for a little while. And I'm going to have that person co-host my stream with me. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. So keep a lookout for announcements on when a stream is going to happen. I'll try to give you as much notice as I can. So whenever it's clear to me that when the time is going to be, I will let you guys know. So right now I'm just base coating. Just base coating her boots flat black from Scale Color. She's got a tire on her base, like an old tire. And there's a gas mask here. I'll probably go ahead and base those black. As I was showing last time I was painting this, I'm going to put her on a plinth, a round display plinth. When I'm ready to do the base, I'm going to attach her to that, put some texture and transition into where she attaches to the base. Did I say blaze? I feel like I just said blaze. If I did, I apologize. Had a really fun but also really challenging day at the rock gym earlier. Once a year they reset most of the routes for a youth climbing competition that they host. And when that happens, in a lot of cases the routes get crazy challenging. Like they're all rated by difficulty level, but they seem to almost be harder than what the normal routes are for what they're rated. And so we have a whole bunch of new routes to try out. So we haven't figured all the moves out to get them clean yet, but we were really working hard today. Cool, welcome back, Painting Troll. While you were gone, I was mentioning that I'm going to be having a special guest. Very, very, very likely that I'll be having a special guest on my stream later this week. So I don't know what times I'll be streaming. My Sunday time might move. I might be able to stream some before that, either like Thursday or Friday. But I'm looking forward to that. Should her gloves be black as well to tie together with those boots, or should we stick with a more brown color for the gloves? Let me know what you guys think. I'm also trying a little bit different lighting setup to light my face better. I've got these additional lights, but I feel like they are creating more shadow on the model. Like you can't really see her legs too well, so I might see what happens if I turn those off. Mr. Heath is continuing to vote for brown gloves. I remember he said that before. All right, 2 out of 2 say brown gloves. Brown it is. So how has your day been, guys? Have you had a nice Sunday? Oh, I also just remember I was contacted by a guy who does a YouTube podcast, or I don't know what you call them if they're video podcasts, but vodcast maybe? I don't know. About maybe being a guest on his vodcast sometime later this month. So if that happens, I'll be sure to let you guys know. Oh, well, thanks for stopping by, Heath. Sorry to see you go, but have a good rest of your Sunday. Is this a big move, Painting Troll? Is it like across the country or to another location, or is it just kind of a move, a couple miles away? I've been there. The house we currently live in was a crazy story. So my wife works as a interior decorator, designer, but also helps people who are getting their houses ready to move. Helps them stage them for resale, so the pictures look really nice and people who come into the house are really impressed by the decor and the layout and everything. And she was helping this couple with this house, and she just came home from that and said, I just found my dream home. And I was in the middle of a bunch of deadlines for work and things were just crazy, but we ended up put an offer in. We got our house ready in something like 4 days. We got all the crap that had built up over time packed up and into a storage unit. We still had 3 bedrooms we had never painted, or 3 rooms we had never painted, so we painted those. We barely slept for 4 days. Got our house on the market because we only had 30 days to get our house sold so we could actually get this one. The sale was contingent on the sale of our house. So we sold about, I think it was 3 weeks from the date of when we started the whole process. But we went from, I was just working under crazy deadlines for work, to we have to have the house on the market in 4 days. That was a whirlwind. Yeah, packing, getting ready to move, selling houses, buying houses, it's all no fun. So I'm doing some lining here to help distinguish colors. It's a lot of muted colors on this model. Browns and greens. So I'm just kind of doing a little black lining. And when you do it with the flat black color I have, it dries to a really nice matte finish, the scale color black. So it really just blends down into the shadows. It doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself, and it helps distinguish the colors from one another. That sounds cool. Definitely post links to it. I would be interested to listen to that podcast. Oh, wow. Painting Troll saying that he doesn't drive and neither does his wife, and they have a 1-year-old, so they're trying to organize all of this stuff. Good luck, man. That sounds like quite an ordeal. Wow. Well, good luck with everything on that end. It's sorry to hear about your grandmother. It's kind of funny. Just before I started the stream today, we have our back door open because it's such a really nice day out, and we've got a screen that encloses it so the cats can't get out. But right next to that back door is a fireplace with a glass covering over it. Because the door's open, there's a reflection from outside, and one of my cats saw a bird fly through our backyard, and he saw the reflection in the fireplace glass, and he sprinted over and put his face up against the fireplace glass like he was looking for where the bird was. I got the biggest kick out of that. Didn't even realize it till this morning, but I guess the Oscars is tonight. Haven't really gone to the movies too much this year, so I don't really know too much about the nominees or we tend to be a little behind in the movies. We watch most of our movies rented through Redbox, which is essentially a movie dispenser that they put at gas stations and grocery stores and places like that. So you go, it costs $1.50, $2, something like that. Dispenses the movie, go watch it, take it back the next day. We tend to watch a lot of our movies there, but they don't, obviously we're not watching things that are out in the theaters that way. Tried doing some line work. Were you doing shadowing? Like, were you going down into the recesses, or were you trying to do the edges, doing edge highlighting? I forgot that I said I was going to try to turn these lights off and see. Actually, I'm not sure how to turn that one off. My wife set it up. Oh, that's not any better, is it? I think it might just be the flat black boots. It's just not reflecting anything from the lights. I could try to turn the brightness up some on the camera. It's crazy. It just wants to absorb all the light. Doesn't want to reflect anything. I guess that's the idea, though. So sorry if you can't see too well what I'm working on. Yeah, that makes sense. You're having trouble with the edge highlighting where you couldn't use the side of your brush. It's definitely tricky. It's a lot of practice, and a good brush helps a lot. All right. Let me think for a bit. What do I want to do for starting to add highlights to this? So what I think I'm going to do is actually use, these are some brownish grays. I'm going to use those. Now, I haven't painted Space Marines in a really, really long time. The commission I'm going to be doing for Pact Team, he wants the Redemptor Dreadnought's doors to be open and like a Space Marine emerging from out of them. He sent me a picture of somebody who had done a similar conversion. So I will need to be painting a Space Marine coming up. It'd be interesting. They have so many round surfaces that they definitely present a unique painting challenge compared to a lot of the models I've been working on lately. I think that's one of the reasons that they sort of made the edge highlighting be a standard. The old Heavy Metal team made that be a standard paint scheme and the style that they would do. So it's an easy way to make that kind of style of model look pretty good without having to have really advanced techniques of how reflections work off of round surfaces and things like that. So the edge highlight picks out all the detail, but it's difficult in the sense of the brush control component of getting all the edges to look good is a little tough, but it's not nearly as difficult as crazy reflection sources. Yeah, I agree. The Heavy Metal style, if you don't do it right, like if you do really thick edge highlights or something, it can look a little tricky, but I think that was their solution to how to paint that type of armor and in a way that they could demonstrate to people. I got some blue on her leg. That's unfortunate. I think there's some on the back too. Anyway, you said if you see a Twitter pic of a snapped paintbrush, you know he's been doing edge highlighting. That's hilarious. So what I did was I just mixed the brown gray with just a little touch of that flat black. That was our base color. I'm just going to start working out the volumes of where at least my intuition tells me things would be a little lighter on the boots. Like I said, I neglected to look up reference pictures like I meant to before before I started on her boots, but we're just gonna play and see what happens. Speaking of non-metallic metal on Space Marines, I tweeted out a picture that one of my favorite painters, Camelson, he's doing a non-metallic metal brushed metal finish on some gray knights. Man, that guy's a wizard. I just can't even believe how fantastically realistic it looks. Yeah, the flat, the matte nature of the scale paints, the first time you see it on a model, it's so crazy. The other thing that I noticed too, because I always put dull coat, which is a Tester's product, I always use that to finish off my models. I think it gives a really nice uniform matte finish on everything. What's interesting is that the paints are so matte, the scale are, even if you paint solid colors, sometimes the sheen looks, not really sheen, but just the texture surface of them looks a little wonky, but then if you spray them with the dull coat, they just sort of magically become a solid color. They look a little chalky, maybe is the word for them, especially the black. But yeah, it's really nice. It's really cool to paint with the matte colors because since I use a matte finish at the end to finish everything off, it gives me a really good sense for how the models are going to look. Whereas if I use a more satiny paint color, the final model with the lack of sheen definitely looks different. That's right. I remember now, Painting Troll, that you had bought the flesh set, right? And you were trying to paint an ogre with the Scale 75 paints. How was that? How did that turn out for you? Did you succeed in making something awesome, or was it a learning experience? Or both? Yeah, I saw his response on that too, that he claims he only uses black and white and Cadian flesh tone to do that brushed metal look. He adds some of the Cadian flesh tone to the mid-tone, so you get a little bit of a warmth to one side where some of your main light source is coming from. It's just crazy how good that model is. I see. Yeah, I find if you go back and watch my flesh tutorial, or what I did for Allie here for the skin tones, I've definitely, I think for scale color, I think they're really meant to be you start with your midtones and you do highlights and shadows, and your base is somewhere in the middle. I don't really feel that the scale color paints are designed necessarily to paint from dark to light. Not saying you can't get decent effects doing that, but I just think that their design is more to be used for glazing techniques, so you glaze into the shadows, you glaze into the highlights, or glaze over textures you've built up for the highlights. I used to paint when I was first painting, and in fact for quite a bit of time, like up until I bought scale paints, really. I painted from dark to light. I would go from my darkest color up to my lightest color. I think those paints are a little more designed for that. But I quickly learned as I started messing around with the scale colors that it just didn't seem to be working the same way. But which was good. It forced me to adapt and learn some new things, and I think I'm a better painter for it. Yeah. Yeah, if Afonso Giraldez, who helped design the paint line, he said you should start at a 5 to 6.5. This is what Painting Troll has said. 5 to 6.5 out of 10. And when you're doing flesh, and he helped develop the paint line. So probably has something to do with why the paints work the way they do. I just want to mention again, by the way, and I'm not getting paid to say this, but the customer service for Scale 75 was pretty fantastic when I had those messed up paints from when I got the whole Warfront range. And there was almost 10 paints, I think, that I just couldn't use. They were too thick or totally dried out. Took a little while to actually get in touch. They claimed they didn't get my first email, but once they started conversing with me, I had the paints within a matter of, I think, 4 days. They must have totally expedited the shipment out of Spain. So I really appreciate that they went out of their way to get me those paints as fast as possible. And I would have been happy just for them to replace the paints, even if it took a while to get to me. But they went above and beyond. there is a Scale 75 USA site now. They are behind the Scale. So what'll happen is not all of the new releases that come out from Scale 75 are immediately available on Scale USA. And when they first announced that the War Colors would be sold individually, so that I could get the entire range, essentially, that I didn't really want to go through and buy all the little sets. And there's overlap across the sets, and it's really hard to tell what's in every set from my point of view. I just wanted to be able to just say, I want the whole range. So I was waiting for them to start selling them individually. And they started selling them individually on the Spanish site, but not the US site. And I also crunched some numbers, and the price that they were charging per bottle on the US site versus what they were charging on the Spanish site with conversion rates, it was cheaper per bottle to buy them from Spain. So instead of just waiting for them to finally show up on the Scale USA site, I just went ahead and ordered them for cheaper from the main site. But you're also thinking about whether you should buy the entire set or the entire line, or just buy one set at a time. It's a tricky question. I initially started off buying just a few sets. I got about half the range on my first order. And I started using them, and I fell in love with them. I loved how they were pushing my painting skill. I loved the colors. I loved how the pigment was. They were great. So I just ended up ordering the whole shebang. And I think I've shown pictures on Twitter of what happens to my workstation over time, because whatever colors I'm using, I ended up once I use them, I just throw them in a pile. And then when I'm done with a project, I organize everything back to nice, neat rows on my paint racks. And I always notice that my giant pile of paints is usually 70% the original Scale color line, 25% the Fantasy and Games, and then 5% is just some random other brand of paints that I might need for something. But I use the Scale color line way more than the Fantasy and Games line. So if you're going to buy one of the two, I definitely recommend the original. I just find the colors to be more my thing. There's a few colors I absolutely love in the Fantasy and Games line, and I've talked about them on previous streams. But if you were just going to get one, I would go all in on the original line. With the caveat that, again, they're not the easiest paints in the world to start to get used to. I wouldn't necessarily recommend as a first-time painter that Scale paints be your first purchase. But if you're getting to that point where you feel like you're getting a handle on how this whole miniature painting thing works, and you want something to push your skill and to help create better results, I can't recommend them enough. And once again, I feel the need to say, I'm not getting paid by them. I mean, if they're listening and they want to sponsor me, hey, I'm all for that. But I just really like their product, and happy to share my love. Yeah, I think so too, Painting Troll. But also when they recommend retail prices, right now the dollar is really strong compared to the euro and the pound and things. It's not always that way, but right now the dollar is pretty strong. So the conversion rate tends to favor us, where I think that the Scale USA site is just going off whatever the recommended retail price is for US market, which doesn't necessarily reflect the current exchange rate. So for the fantasy and games, he's saying the unnatural flesh set might be better than the normal flesh set. I'm not sure I would go that far, only because I think that you get a wider range of natural flesh tones in the original. You only get, in the unnatural flesh tone set, you really only get 3 colors that you can use to make like normal Caucasian skin. Whereas, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 in the original painting one that you can sort of do different mixes off to get some variations. And also the Indian shadow is a really good color for glazing in and creating some nice shadow colors. What the unnatural flesh set does have some nice, it's like a greenish flesh tone. So, you know, if you're doing undead flesh, another greenish flesh tone. So if you're doing some things like that, it's pretty good. It has Bloodfest Crimson in it, which is a really nice crimson color that I like. And I would say that Harvester Flesh and Resurrection Flesh, these two, are probably better than any of the flesh colors you get in the original flesh tone set. I often prime or base coat with Resurrection Flesh when I'm doing the flesh colors. So in that respect, you know, the unnatural flesh set is good. And in fact, if somebody was asking me which sets they should buy from the fantasy, if they were going to buy sets instead of individual paints from the Fantasy and Games line, I would recommend the unnatural flesh paint set. The other one I would recommend for sure is the, I think it's called Colors of Doom, maybe. It's the one for near the end where they have, they've got Innsmouth Blue, Ryla Gray, Tindalos Red. These are some of my favorite colors also from the Fantasy and Games line. So again, if you're wanting to buy sets from Fantasy and Games, those are probably my 2 highest recommendations. And if you wanted to pick up a third one, whichever one has Arfin Jade, Elendil Violet, Huldra Blue, whatever has those ones as well. I'm not sure what the set's called. That would probably be my third recommendations. I could pretty much live without the rest of them. The red, orange, yellow one, not any real difference from other oranges and reds and things you can get. I don't really love the greens from the Fantasy and Games line. I'll sometimes use the Decay Black from that line when I don't want it to be so flat. Sometimes when I'm doing top glazing, like I'll probably do on these boots, to glaze over all the colors and restore some of the black, rich blackness to the boots. probably use that color. I like the flat black better for glazing into shadows and things, but the other thing I'm going to do on these boots, very, very likely, is I'm going to go back in and put some dust on them. I'm going to try for the first time using weathering pigments to do work on the base, and then tie the dust on the boots into whatever dust is on the base. The jade is in the elven colors, so yeah, that might be a decent set. Yeah, I think they have just yeah, I wouldn't get the greens. I wouldn't get the reds and yellows. I wouldn't get whichever, maybe like a leather type set. I really don't use any of those colors, like the peanut butter. And Bosch chestnut's not too bad, but I mean, you can always get that as a single color. So far from messing around with the Warcolors paints. Oh, I always get the two mixed up. Warcolors versus, I should ask now. So you mentioned Warcolors. Is Warcolors, you talking about the brand Warcolors that have the gel medium paint, or are you talking about the Warfront paints from Scale 75? So I always end up saying the wrong names for those, so. Yeah, I agree. I am interested to try the Warcolors range. That they are out of Greece. They use they claim they use a gel medium in the paint, which is supposed to be very different from the other paint lines out there. And I've heard people that I trust say that the white from Warcolors is the best white they've ever used, which that intrigues me. But the Warfront range, I've messed around with them a little bit so far. I used them for her green, for her shirt. So her shirt is all painted in, the green shirt is all in the Warfront range. I think yeah, I don't remember if I did something else on her with them. They seem to be quite a lot like the scale color. They're very matte finish. Her green has a little sheen to it right now because I added some mixing medium when I did glazing with it on the final coat, and that created a satin finish. I'm going to knock it all down with dull coat anyway later, but if you see a little satiny on the green, that's why. It's not the actual paint. It's the P3 mixing medium, which is has a satin finish to it. All right, so paint control asked, am I a purely water additive painter? Do I use other mixing mediums? And then there's a second part to this question, which I'll address in a second. I tend to just add water, and it's just what I've always done. I didn't even own most of the various additives and mediums until the last year when I got ready to start messing around with some airbrush painting. So I got some flow improver, thinner, and then I went ahead and picked up some mediums and stuff. I will say that I will occasionally use a P3 mixing medium. And when I do this, it's usually when I'm using a lot of inks in my paints. So like the P3 inks, which are just purely liquid pigment. They don't have all the additives into them. So if you want to use them to stain the layers below and create a nice rich color, it helps to add the mixing medium because it's a fluid to suspend the ink into, and it holds everything together. So makes it thinner also, so that you can really spread everything out. You can put it on in really thin layers. If you just use it straight out of the pot, it's so concentrated you have no control over it. But also if you just add water to those inks, they just separate like crazy right off the bat. So I like to add mixing medium for that. Every so often, if I just notice a certain paint doesn't work as well when it's thinned, I mean, most of the scale colors are really good, but for instance, I used this Black Forest Green on one of the Malifaux model's dresses, and I really didn't like the way that it glazed. So if I try to glaze with this again, I will probably add medium to it because there was something weird about how the pigment was separating with just water. So it tends to be based on color nowadays more so than anything else, whether I add something to it. But I tend to just use water. And most of that is because I spent almost 20 years just learning to paint by adding water to my paint. I never added anything else. So the second part of his question or comment says, there seems to be some snobbery in the hobby community if you don't just use water, like if you start to add stuff. I mean, I certainly hope none of that's ever coming from me. I never usually comment on any of that stuff, but you know, that stuff is so weird. Like, why would anybody look down on anybody else for how they want to paint? This is a hobby. You're supposed to be enjoying yourself, right? Why do people got to be like that? I don't know. So I certainly could see where some painters might be like that, but there's also painters who are jerks. So I certainly don't see anything wrong. If it's like I've said before, everything is a tool in your toolkit. So things like, I don't use a lot of dry brushing, but I'm not going to look down on anybody who dry brushes. Dry brushing is a tool. I do dry brush sometimes. It comes in really handy for certain things. And if you're doing speed painting on armies and that's what you care for, and then that's the best technique for you, like I'm not going to look down at you because you use dry brushing when it's not a technique I use quite as often, but I do use it. Same kind of deal with that. So if the snobbery exists, that just means those people are jerks. And that means their opinion doesn't really matter that much anyway. You should do what works for you. You should focus on enjoying your hobby. People who feel the need to look down on other people's hobby aren't people you need to worry about listening to anyway. And you can also come back at them, and Jennifer Haley, who I'm pretty sure she's won at least one Slayer sword, if not multiple Slayer swords, generally considered one of the best painters in the world. She uses, to thin her paints, she uses a mixture of, I have the recipe written down somewhere here. I think her recipe's sitting in my office. It's a mixture of flow improve, I think, something like a mixture of flow improver, a drying retarder, water, and maybe some thinner. But then Anne Forrester, who's also an amazing painter, she uses a mixture of drying retarder, flow improver, and water for her paints. And those are two of the best painters in the world. So they certainly aren't just using water when they paint. It's funny, though, as you mentioned stuff about painting snobbery, that there is a very well-known painter, and I won't name names, but this painter has this reputation as believing in the one true way of painting. And so, the belief that essentially there's one right technique for doing everything. There's one, I don't know. And I had heard this about this painter, but had never personally encountered any of it. But I was posting some pictures in a group one day. And this painter felt the need to come in and comment on how I was doing a bunch of things wrong, which is just such a silly idea. How can you be doing something wrong? You're just painting to enjoy yourself and produce something that makes you happy. But I came to understand why this painter has that reputation. Yeah, so Painting Trolls found the exact. So Ann Forster is 80% Folk Art Extender, 10% Winsor and Newton Flow Improver, 10% water. Jen Haley's is 25% Liquitex Slow Dry, 25% Winsor and Newton Flow Improver, and 50% water. The reason I have Jen Haley's recipe in the other room is I was trying that mixture as an additive to airbrush paint, or to paint for the airbrush, and see what that did for when I was using it out of an airbrush. He was reading a Reaper article on it today, and that was where it was in. I think I found it on somebody's blog who was quoting that same Reaper article. But yeah, I know they don't make a secret out of their thing. Yep, and he said neither of them use a wet palette as far as I'm aware. Yeah, if you do something silly and it works, it's no longer silly. It's just a technique. Quoted for truth, Painting Troll. I also think you'll hear me say it a lot. Just try things and see what happens. In the end, it's just paint. If you have to, you just paint over it or strip and start again. But it's not until you actually try something that you know whether it works or not. That's kind of the history of human innovation. It's people who were trying things that nobody else had ever done before and finding things that worked. I think Diego kicked him off his bed just a few minutes ago, so he's upset at his brother. One of my cats was being a bully to our other cat. Kicked him off of his high perch bed that he was sleeping in. So now he's all grumpy because he woke up from his nap and got kicked out of his bed. Yeah, definitely some of the means. Like I was saying, for her green shirt, for example, I added the mixing medium from P3, which is not a matte medium. I do have some matte medium, but one of the times I used it, it seemed to make whatever I was doing a little chalkier than I wanted. So I really like the P3 mixing medium. But I always come back in, as I said before, I use dull coat over the top of it anyway. So usually for me, I don't really care if the sheen gets affected as I'm working, because I always put a finishing varnish on to get the finish that I want. But I know there's a lot of people who paint for competitions and things who don't want to have any kind of product on top of their paint job. They want to be able to control everything. So they don't necessarily varnish at the end. And so for them, they're really careful with things like how many glaze coats they do, because sometimes the more glaze coats that you use, the shinier things get. I've also heard but never experienced that different brands of paints, just based on the things that they have in them, have enough variation that if you use certain brands of thinners or certain brands of mediums that you add to them, that they just don't work very well. They don't react very well with that particular paint. So it can be a little trial and error, especially if there's the same manufacturer who makes the paint doesn't make all of the additives. Like, I assume the mixing medium that P3 puts in their bottle is probably just the exact same stuff they use as the medium for their basic paints. They just don't add any tint to it. So you know, theoretically it should be great for their paints, but might not work with some other brands. I could imagine the War Colors range, like I mentioned earlier, that claims to have this gel base for their paint. I would be very curious to know how those paints react to all the different additives that people usually use to mess with their acrylic paints. I have no idea. Yeah, Painting Troll said he's trying to force himself to remember that painting transitions don't have to be smooth. And that is true. There's a whole movement out there about embracing brush strokes and letting people see the texture in your paint, and then it's okay. If you think about it as art, I mean, people like Van Gogh, texture was a key element in his art. So when you think about it that way, you don't have to try to make something perfectly smooth to be good. If you're trying to convey something with some feeling or style with the texture that you do. Or if your purposes are not to try to create something for display and you don't really care, like you just want something that looks good from a couple feet away on the tabletop, that's obviously a different issue. And the other thing to remember too, as you get better with techniques like the glazing that I use a lot, is that you can have your layers be rough and you can see the color transitions and it's not all smooth and perfect. But then by doing some glazing coats, it starts to tie all the layers together. It actually smooths things out quite a bit, even though your initial paint that you laid down is not super smooth. I mean, obviously you can look at the toe of her boot, but I'm going to take care of some of that. But I don't have to. I mean, I could leave it like this. Yeah, that's another good point. So he said some painters, they do skin looks butter smooth, but then on the cloth there's texture. You can see the individual layers. I don't know if you're saying that as a good thing or a bad thing, but I definitely think having variety of textures on a model can be really good, because part of the contrast that you're creating can not just be contrast of colors, but also contrast of styles and the degree of smoothness. All right, this is the moment I always love, because after I've just spent however long painting all of those layers, now I'm just going to paint over them all. I think one of the painters I really admire, he goes by Big Dino on Twitter. I think it's at Big Dino, Bigdeno. I think that's his handle. He puts out really, really high quality work, and he's fast. I mean, he claims to only paint 3 hours a day, but it seems like he's got a whole new 75 scale miniature done in 3 or 4 days. And when you look at it, if you look up really close on his models, he doesn't go through and smooth everything out. He's got, you can see some layers on his stuff. Sometimes he just doesn't even worry. He just sketches things out on the models. But his color choices, and it's all just, it works. It works so well. I always like to look at his stuff to remind myself of the same thing, that it is okay to not have everything be perfectly smooth. There we go. Lost one of my brushes for a minute. But then there's also painters that are so meticulous with making everything perfectly smooth, and that's really impressive as well when they can pull that off. Camelson, I mentioned him earlier, he's one of them. His stuff is so smooth, but I know he takes a very long time to achieve that. And I know part of the reason I really believe that there's almost like a movement now for anti-smoothness. They really want to emphasize that they are not painting smooth and they're doing it on purpose. I won't use the exact terminology that they use, because this is a family-friendly video stream. But for a long time, I think it was part of that paint snobbery again, where people who were going and competing in painting competitions, creating perfectly smooth transitions was seen as something very, very difficult to do and showed off your skill. And so it almost became necessary that everything was perfectly smooth if you were even going to be considered in those kinds of competitions. And so then people who really wanted to use their painting as an artistic expression and play with textures and play with colors were getting frustrated of this attitude that somehow what they were doing was not as impressive as these people who would just meticulously glaze on 100 layers to create a perfectly smooth transition. And while I tend to kind of like smoothness in my own painting, I completely sympathize with where they're coming from. Because again, I'm on the side of anyone who's doing what they enjoy and what they love and feels like represents what they want to represent on the model. I don't have any particular position about anything related to this hobby. It's kind of like it mirrors a little bit the discussion of non-metallic metal versus true metal paints. There's some of that goes around in the hobby too, where people are die-hard one or the other, and they think if you're not painting non-metallic metal, or you're not painting with true metals, like you're doing it wrong. I just don't get all of that attitude. Part of the bad side of human experience a lot, I think, where for some reason a lot of our interactions, we feel this need to be right, like to be seen as authority figures or to be seen as having the answer. And so we staunchly defend whatever position that we hold and don't take the time or energy to try to see things from another person's point of view. It's just more manifestations of that unfortunate aspect of our culture. I think you might be right, Painting Troll. I think he might be the one who started it. And I agree with the sentiment that do what you love, man. Exactly. I agree with you. Somehow forcing other people to paint their way validates their own work in some way. It's just unfortunate. And I think that applies to the rest of what I was talking about as well. There's nothing wrong with having preferences. Like, I don't tend to paint with metallic paints, but it's not because I have anything against them. It's just what I do. I just like it. But when I see people who have done amazing things with metallic paints, I'll bookmark those things. I'll save them and put them in my inspirations folder. There's no one true path. Except the one you blaze yourself. One of the things I love most about this hobby is seeing what other people do and trying to learn from it. Pick up a few little new twists and tricks, things that I can try and fold into my own repertoire. And I've certainly developed a style of my own over time, and I think some of the people that I would say are my favorite artists, favorite miniature painters, are actually people that really, their stuff doesn't look all that much like mine. And part of the pleasure I have in seeing somebody like Ben Kometz do his thing, or Camelson, or somebody like that, is just really appreciating the art that they're making and how their style is expressed across various models that they paint. I love the way that we can all take the same exact model, and by the end of it, you almost wouldn't even believe that they're the same model. Colors and the styles are so different, so unique. Thanks. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm liking how they're turning out. Getting pretty close to being done, I think, on them. I want to go over that toe a little bit more just to make sure it's not too stark. And then I will most likely do a little bit of glazing of some purple into the shadows. Bring up the focus on them, so I'm show you. So we built up that texture underneath, and glazing over with the black brings them back to be nice black boots, but the texture adds a little bit of indication that there's some wear and tear there. Just a little depth That's not boring flat black. And then, like I said, my plan right now is to practice with weathering powders. And so I'll put some weathering powders onto the boots and then fix those into place. Give her boots a nice little dusty appearance. Also probably go back with black and go down into the crevices. And just reinforce some of those darkest shadows. I did see that they're relaunching the Confrontations line. I'll be interested to see if they're relaunching all of the models from the original lines in that first iteration or even with the second iteration. Like, I would be interested in picking up another copy or two because it looks like they're doing them in resin. I think I would love to pick up one or two more of those Prowlers, the Wolfen Prowler that I did last year, the Ninja Wolf. I would love to get another copy or two of that guy, but I didn't see him in the initial pictures of what they were releasing, but I don't think that was comprehensive. So I'm really interested to see what models they do. And then it sounds like they're going to be doing some new models in the future as well. So that'll be really interesting. Confrontations, it's kind of a weird line for me. They have some of my absolute favorite sculpts ever. And they also have models that I would never paint. I guess that's probably true about most companies' lines, but the style of their work is just so different and so kind of wonky that they produce some really, really nice stuff, but then also some things that just not my cup of tea. I ended up selling most of my confrontation miniatures I had in my bits box. I ended up selling those last year. I had a bunch of the Lion Knights. Had some wizards and things. Models I had purchased for RPGing for some different campaigns. But just decided I just have too many models to paint, and so got rid of most of them. So I don't know how hard I would go in on the relaunch. But if they have the Wolfen Prowler, I'd be hard pressed to not try to get one or two more copies of him, especially being in resin. That was one of the hardest parts of painting him when I did. He's a big metal model. It's kind of tough to hold him and move him around to get to all the details. I'm hitting about the 2-hour mark, which is usually where I stop. But I'm just going to keep going until I finish these boots. Yeah, that's the same thing. I didn't see the Prowler in their initial launch, but I wasn't sure because they said they were doing 170 or 190 models. I wasn't sure if that was all going to be in their initial launch or not, so I wasn't sure if what they were showing was comprehensive or not. But we'll see. Yeah, it really kind of came out of left field. I had no idea that somebody had bought the rights to redo Confrontation. Be interesting to see what the community response is to this relaunch, since they've been away from the game for so long. I'm certainly sure there's going to be a lot of people with nostalgia who remember those miniatures fondly and want to pick up some more. But the game is very, and I don't mean the game as in playing the game, I mean the game as in the just the hobby community as a whole, has changed a lot since they were sold. Used to be, they were some of the most innovative and creative and interesting models out there. And so I know a lot of people who were painters or collectors loved their models just because they had so many details and they were so fun to paint. But the painting or the model makers have come a long way. And we have no shortage of amazing companies producing jaw-dropping miniatures nowadays. I'd be really curious to see where Confrontation fits into the modern hobby landscape. I'm starting to get the feeling, and I don't know if other people are as well. This isn't completely new. I've kind of had this feeling for about the last year that Kickstarter is starting to become quite crowded for the miniature hobby. It seems like every other week, or maybe even every week, there's some new company kickstarting some game with tons of high quality miniatures, and I just think we're reaching an odd saturation point where you just wonder, new amazing model lines just going to become lost in the white noise that is the endless march of Kickstarter models coming out. I know for myself, I've reached that fatigue point with Kickstarter where I backed so many in a relatively short time, and now they're all starting to roll in. I'm starting to get the models, and I'm realizing just how many models I purchased. And I'm kind of at the point where I really can't back any more Kickstarters because I just realized that, I'm going to be hard pressed to finish the models I already have, let alone any new ones that I get. So it'll be interesting to see how that starts to affect the hobby as time goes on. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, the model you said the models are starting to show their age. Some of the confrontation miniatures, and I agree. That Wolf and Prowler is such a classic model, though. It's just as gorgeous today, I think, as the day it was released. I think it was one of the apexes of their design and sculpting work. So we'll see. But yeah, and you mentioned some of the companies with big IPs like Cool Mini or Not. Even companies like Privateer Press, you know, they did a big Kickstarter to fund the video game they created that also had models embedded in it to try to get the gamers who weren't really interested in the video game but wanted the limited edition models to buy in. And while I understand that companies like that might say, well, we don't have the cash flow of a company like Games Workshop, maybe. And so we could use Kickstarter to help fund our expansion into these other ways. But it certainly moves away from what Kickstarter seems to have been designed for, which was to help new companies I also heard for Cool Mini or Not, somebody who's kind of an insider in the biz, I have no idea if this is true or not, but they claim it was, that